So I had shared with you many, many years ago a midrash that I enjoyed, and then I had forgotten about it for a while until this past month or so. I got a piece that someone had written and reminded me of this midrash, and I felt it was appropriate, so I wanted to share it again with you on this Yom Kippur morning. It happened in ancient days. There were two brothers. One was single and one was married, and they were farming farms next to each other. And one night, the single brother couldn't sleep, and he said, my poor married brother has children, and we have the same size farms, and he has so many mouths to feed, and I have just one. And so he went to his barn, and he loaded up his cart, and he began to bring it to sneak it into his brother's barn because he knew his brother wouldn't accept it. He was too proud. Well, that same night, the married brother couldn't sleep, and he said, my poor single brother, I have children that will take care of me in my old age. He has no one but himself. He needs more to take care of himself and sustain him. And so that brother as well went into his barn, loaded up his wagon, and began to sneak it into the brother's barn. It happened they were on the road at the same time, and they ran into each other. And they realized what was going on, and they hugged each other. And on that very spot, the temple in Jerusalem was built many years later because of brotherly love. Now, there is a modern midrash that's a little different. There were two brothers. One was single and one was married, and they had two plots of land that they farmed next to each other. And one night, the single brother got up and said, my married brother has all those children to be with him and take care of him, and I've got nothing. I'm just alone. And so he took his wagon with the intention of going and stealing some from his brother because he felt he needed it. Well, that same night, the married brother said, what a selfish brother I have. He's single and he hoards all that food, and I have all these mouths to feed. So he took his wagon and he too started out on the same road. Well, they met each other on that very road, and they realized what each other was about to do, and they beat each other to a pulp. And on that very spot, the Knesset was built. Now, I like the first midrash better than the second, but I have to say that in these last months, that is much more what the Jewish world has been like, that second one, of us beating each other up over the Iran deal. And on the fringes, and not always just on the fringes, some terrible, terrible things have been said and have been accused. There's been vitriol and intense hostility with those who disagreed one way or another. It's been heartbreaking for me to see in our community. Jews who for years were on the same sides, supportive of Israel, supportive of the United States, who have long records to show that, attacking each other with such anger and such hatred, eviscerating, skewering each other, calling others traitors on the internet, calling for harm to be done to those who disagreed with him. There are those who still deeply believe that what we are seeing is a replay of 1938 and of what happened during those days that could potentially lead to a Holocaust, a second one, or even a world war with nuclear weapons. I have to admit, one thing that I absolutely know is that I am no prophet. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I'm willing to admit that I have no idea about the future. And I agree with Amos Oz in this. Amos Oz is a great Israeli writer. I believe he should have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, but because of the politics of the committee and Israel in the world opinion, I believe he's been denied it. He gave an interview recently, and he said this: He said, I think Iran is dangerous, but it's dangerous because the future is dangerous. The idea that if somehow Iran can be blocked, everything will be fine is historically short-sighted. He said, look at Pakistan. It's a nuclear power now. It's only a few inches away from becoming a fanatic Muslim country overnight. And there's no guarantee that we will not wake up tomorrow morning and discover that Pakistan is more fanatic, fundamentalist, extremist than Iran. What do we do then? The future is dangerous. Although Amos Oz knows nothing about the future, most people on both sides of the arguments seem to pretend that they did, that they knew for a certainty what would happen if we did this deal and what would happen if the deal didn't happen. They said it over and over with increasing clarity, that they visualized exactly what would happen, and because of that, they were willing to destroy reputations of others who disagreed with them. All I know is I know something about the past, not the future. The first historical mention where the people Israel is mentioned in history is on a tablet that came out of Egypt in the 13th century BCE. It's called the Merneptah tablet. And these are the words written on it. Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. 13th century BCE, we were destroyed according to this. So how did we get here? Why are we still here? Because we understand that it isn't about projecting into the future, it's about dealing with reality. Whatever is in front of us, we deal with, and we are strong, and we are resilient, and we have shown over and over again the ability over these 3,000 years to endure and to grow and to strengthen each other. I believe we can face any future, whatever it is. What is it that we haven't faced, and yet we're still here? And so at this moment, I would look to us in our perseverance, in our ingenuity, and in our flexibility. And by the way, I do want to remind you that even the greatest of Jewish minds, when they tried to predict the future, were dead wrong. And I believe one of those greatest, most inspirational of minds was the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. Menachem Mendel Schneerson was and will always be a great shining light among our people, and did great things that are still affecting our people, Jews and non-Jews, everywhere in the world. But he was adamant in his opposition against Camp David Accords. He fought tooth and nail at every place he could to stop it because he believed that all it was a setup for Egypt to attack Israel and destroy Israel. Now, since 1979, hardly an Israeli soldier has been killed by an Egyptian soldier because of that agreement. In all those years, with all the battles, with all the wars that have happened, with Gaza, with Lebanon, that pact, that treaty has held. He was brilliant, and he understood the Jewish world, but he didn't understand any more about the future than you or I do. On Yom Kippur, last night, we asked God to pray with the Avaryanim. Avaryanim is a really strange word. We call it sinners. We say sinners, but it comes from the root that means to be in opposition. We're all Avaryanim. We're all in opposition in some way to each other. We all have different views on various things, and yet we come together and we pray together. And not only do we pray together, we hope together, and we work together. No matter what the future will bring, we will find a way to persevere and to flourish. And that is what I know. And that I know for a surety. And I can say that absolutely. We've been tested. Believe in those tests. Believe in ourselves. We understand the dangers, and we will overcome them. when Lewis Carroll wrote about Alice that sometimes before breakfast she believes in 6 impossible things, I want you to know that I list 6 things every morning when I say my prayers. I list 6 things in my lifetime that have happened in my lifetime that are impossible. Hebrew, a dead language, is now spoken by over 8 million Jews and non-Jews in the world. That's impossible. It's like Latin suddenly coming back and being the language of Italy. How did it happen? Impossible. But we did it. The state of Israel was gone for 2,000 years, and we have it. How did that happen? How do we even imagine that happened? And yet, we live in the time of the state of Israel. And think about that Israel in its 67 plus years. Think about its achievements in agriculture, its achievements in water conservation, in energy production and efficiency, in the sciences, in the humanities. The fact that Jews were not ever thought of as great soldiers in modern times. And yet Israel has one of the greatest armies in the world. And it's been tested and proven over and over. You know, in 1948, when Ben-Gurion declared the state, he never, in his wildest imagination, could have foreseen the miracles that we take for granted today. He couldn't. He never dreamed this. Do you know right now, the one dream that he did have about the Negev is starting to happen. The Negev is beginning to actually become a place that is desirable and that people are moving to and that high tech is moving to. Now, at that same time, there was a Secretary of State when the state was declared, George Marshall, great and brilliant general, good, wonderful Secretary of State, the author of the Marshall Plan that brought Europe back. But he threatened David Ben-Gurion, and he said, you must not declare the state of Israel. And if you do, we will not come to your aid, and the 6 Arab armies that are crouched to destroy you will in fact destroy you. They will drive you into the sea. David Ben-Gurion declared the state. It's impossible. George Marshall couldn't imagine a soldier who had fought World War II against the Nazis effectively could not imagine that possibility, that this little state would survive that. Samuel Rosner said this as the debate was going on about Iran, that it grew in intensity. He said, take a deep breath. Israel has serious problems, external and internal, but it is not likely to disintegrate anytime soon. In fact, Israel's main problem might be anxiety. It worries too much. Most events that will shape the future of Israel cannot be predicted. The world keeps changing, and Israel has to ensure that it remains strong militarily and morally. History shows that Israel is quite good at adapting to quick changes. Israel the state and Israel us. We're quite good at it. It was 3 years after the Holocaust and the loss of 1/3 of our people that the state was declared and found independence. 3 years. How is that possible? But it exists. We live in an age of impossibilities. I return to the words that Amos Oz said in his interview. I'm very, very critical, he said, of the policy of my government. I'm critical of its policy on the Palestinian issue. I'm critical of its policy on the settlements. I'm critical of its policy on domestic issues. But it's no secret that I love Israel. I love Israel even at times when I don't like it. And I'll tell you a secret, he said. I love Israel even at moments when I can't stand it. That's me too. That's true for me. And why? Ask me why I love my wife, or my children, or my grandchildren, or their spouses. Ask me why I love this congregation, or my people. In Hebrew, when you ask the question lama, in Israel you say kacha, because. Stam. It is. It exists. But I love the real Israel. I don't love the fantasy Israel. I know how many problems she has. I visit her often. I read her press. I read the critics. And I understand all of those kinds of problems. And I love Israel the way Amos Oz does, because she is the way she is. In so many ways, she's exemplary and she's miraculous. 18 years ago, there was a terrorist bombing in a restaurant, and a mother was killed, and a strange woman picked up that woman's baby and carried that baby to safety. This year, that 18-year-old little baby, that girl, entered the IDF with a uniform. She was accompanied by that same woman who stayed with her all 18 years. That's Israel. But let me tell you also about Israel. There's a girl that went over there to serve from an American family. She's a lone soldier. Her name is Ariella. And this is what she wrote standing in Yad Vashem, looking at the relics there in her uniform. She said, "I stare at the reflection in the glass box in front of me. There stands a soldier dressed in the olive green uniform of the Jewish people circa 1948 to the present. I stare at the picture of a Jewish prisoner's tattooed arm. That was his identification. And I feel the thump of my dog tag hit my chest as I turn to leave the room. That's my identification." That's Israel. Young Jews who go there to serve when they don't have to. There was a wedding in Gadara in Israel this past year. The bride's mother had died 2 years earlier, and her father died right on the cusp of the wedding. So many of the guests kind of believed the wedding would be postponed because of the death. And so when the bride and groom showed up, there were less than 12 guests, and they'd reserved a hall, and they'd had this whole wedding planned out. So one of the guests put on Facebook that this had happened and asked anybody to come to fill the hall, to celebrate with them. That post on Facebook went out at 10 o'clock at night. It was a Saturday night. 2,000 Israelis showed up. And they brought checks, and they wrote on the envelope cash, because they didn't know the name of the bride or the groom. And they danced with the bride and the groom. Where does that happen? Really, where does that happen? 2,000 strangers come to a wedding because at night they saw on Facebook that a bride and a groom were alone and needed support. There was a young girl, a tragedy, a 22-year-old Ecuadorian woman who was killed in Israel this year. She was just completing her conversion to Judaism. And when she was killed, hundreds and hundreds of people showed up to her funeral who had never met her before. And there were fashionable Tel Avivians, there were black hats, there were people in army green and in earlocks and dreadlocks. There were wealthy people, there were poor. None of them had ever met Karen Yemima before. That's Israel. And Israel is a lifeguard on the beach of Tel Aviv that I heard, who said, "Lady," this was over the loudspeaker in front of everyone, those of you that have been there, "Lady, you with the bikini that looks like a starfish, get out of the deep." But then, he said, "If you lost an 11-year-old boy, we have him here, but don't hurry back, we'll raise him right." That's Israel that I love. For all its complexity, Israel is rated the 5th happiest nation in the world, higher than the United States by far. The 9th healthiest in the world in the way that it eats. Its Arab population, when they poll them, 65% of the Arab Israelis poll that they are proud to be Israelis. 65%. We only hear the complaints, but the majority are even supportive of the Israeli police and the Israeli Supreme Court. And of course, Israel has mastered the water crisis. California hasn't. Much of the world is struggling, but Israel will be exporting not only water, but its technology of how to solve the drought problem, because Israel no longer has a problem with water, and that's been from the days of the Bible. And Israel no longer has an energy problem. It will be exporting it as well. Anne Roiphe, in thanking God that Israel is not like every other nation, said, "It may not be fair, but I hold America and Israel to higher standards." And I do as well, and I hope you do. Both of them fail, but both of them succeed in ways that don't happen in other places. Both of them are places that people immigrate to, want to come in. They're not leaving. In fact, Israel has one of the lowest emigration rates in the world. We often think about Israelis leaving because we see them here, but they have one of the lowest in the world. But I want to share just two final incidents. One had to do with Tel Aviv University in their international master's program. They're valedictorian this year. His name was Haitham Hassanein. He's an Egyptian born and raised. This is what he said when he spoke at his valedictory. "On my very first day here at the university, I saw men in kippahs, women in headscarves and hijabs. I saw soldiers walking peacefully among crowds of lively students, Jews, Muslims, Christians, Druze, Bedouins, and international students. How fascinating," he said, "is it to be in a city where you can go to a beach in central Tel Aviv and see a Muslim woman, a couple of gays kissing, and a Hasid sharing the same small space. We must always question our assumptions," he said. "Being here in Israel has taught me that life is full of paradoxes and complexities, that nothing is straightforward, and that things are often not as they are made to seem." And lastly, I want to share these words. They're words that I shared earlier in the chapel. They were written by a British nationalist, a young man named Oliver Marjotte. He had a chip on his shoulder about Israel, but he went. And when he left Israel, he wrote words, a beautiful long poem. These are excerpts from them. He said, "I came to you, Israel, wanting to hate you, to be confirmed in my reasonable European certainty of your arrogant oppression, lounging along the Mediterranean coast, facing west in your vast carelessness and American wealth. I wanted to smirk in my Protestant confidence. I didn't realize you were broken as well as wealthy, fragile as well as strong. I didn't realize that you suffer from 1,000 voices clamoring in your head, and that some of these voices care about justice and democracy, and that some of them care about your neighbors. I didn't realize that 1,000 enemies press on your borders, hoarding instruments of death as chaos and darkness and madness consume the world every way you look. Nobody told me, or maybe they did, and I refused to listen. I didn't expect to fall in love with you. I love the Hebrew you speak, the churches you wear like flowers in your hair, the proud golden dome that crowns your head. I love the strength of your soldiers, the warmth of your sun, the joy of your songs, the peace of your kibbutzim. I'm not ashamed to say it. I love you. I'm sorry I had to leave you. I know I had no right to love you. What's 10 days compared to a year, a childhood, a lifetime, or the 5,000-year lifetime of a people? I will come back to you. I will. Until then, Israel. Until then, Shalom. I'm going back to Israel again this year. Will you? This afternoon, when we have Israel bonds, I'll invest in Israel again. Will you? And this year, in spite of all the fighting and infighting and whatever position they took, I will be supporting the Federation. I will be supporting AIPAC. I will be supporting the AJC and the New Israel Fund. I will support Jews who support Jews, whatever their position, because I know it takes all of us to figure out whatever the future will bring. And I know that we don't know what that is. So we need each other in order to flourish. We must have a sense of loving each other. This Yom Kippur, that is what I believe. What do you believe? And more importantly, on Yom Kippur, what are you willing to do about your beliefs?